Governor Pritzker, for the first time, calling for the removal of President Trump from office.
This on the same day the president said dangerous cities like Chicago should be used as training grounds for the military. Political reporter Chris Ty here now with all that and new details on the 100 military troops the president wants to send to Illinois. Chris?
Joe and Erica, even for two politicians that are political enemies and who spar regularly, this day stands out from the rest. You'll hear what they said here in a second. As for what troops are headed here, the likeliest will be from the Illinois National Guard, which insiders say Governor Pritzker has control over.
Something rare happened today in American politics. Not loud at first glance. Not explosive in form, but the kind of moment that, in hindsight, divides history into before and after. It began with words that were not supposed to be said out loud, at least not by the people who said them. A sitting governor for the first time openly questioning whether the president should remain in office. Almost simultaneously, the president himself spoke about American cities as if they were hostile territory, places to be used, not protected. Training grounds, domestic terrain. And this is where the main thing begins, because these two statements were not isolated, emotional outbursts. They landed on the same day, within the same political hour, against a backdrop that most people still underestimate. At first, it looked like another escalation between political enemies who have been sparring for years. That kind of conflict usually follows a predictable script. Press conferences, counterstatements, social media outrage, and then silence until the next cycle. But this time, the machinery underneath started moving in a different way. Quietly, procedurally, with people who normally never appear together suddenly sharing the same institutional space. And when that happens, it's rarely about rhetoric anymore, it's about containment. Behind closed doors, conversations shifted from strategy to damage control, from optics to emergency mechanics. Because the issue was no longer what the president said, but what his words unlocked. When you publicly discuss deploying military force inside the country, when you describe cities as zones to be controlled rather than communities to be governed, you cross an invisible line. Most leaders flirt with that line rhetorically. Few step over it while the system is already under stress. And the system was under stress long before today. There had been court orders stacking up, quietly ignored by the public. Testimony that didn't make headlines but landed heavily in legal rooms. Internal assessments that never reach microphones. It all looks like a trifle until you put it together. One piece alone means nothing. 10 pieces form a pattern. 20 pieces form a warning. Today, that warning stopped being abstract. What made this moment different wasn't the outrage. It was the coordination. Figures who have spent years defending the president suddenly stopped defending anything at all, not attacking him, not condemning him, just stepping aside. And silence in politics is often louder than protest. When institutions withdraw their protection, they don't announce it. They signal it to each other. At the same time, pressure began rising in places most people never watch. State authority versus federal authority. Who controls which forces, under what legal framework, and for how long? On paper, it's all technical. In reality, it's the difference between a constitutional standoff and something far messier. Governors are not meant to refuse the federal government lightly. Presidents are not meant to test that refusal publicly. When both sides start preparing for that possibility, it means the trust layer has already collapsed. What followed in Washington only deepened that sense. Emergency meetings that were never meant to exist. Alignments that should be politically impossible. Language that is usually reserved for history books suddenly appearing in real time. Not accusations, not slogans. Formal wording. Carefully chosen. Because once that wording enters the record, it cannot be taken back. And then there was the reaction from the president himself. Not measured, not strategic, not calming. Words spoken in anger have consequences when spoken from power, especially when those words are interpreted not as opinion, but as instruction. Law enforcement understood that immediately. Security agencies understood it faster than anyone else. They don't wait for intent to be clarified. They prepare for outcome. Outside, the atmosphere thickened. Crowds formed with opposing purposes, feeding off the same uncertainty. Barriers that exist mostly for symbolism suddenly mattered. Movement through familiar spaces changed. Routes closed. Protocols expanded. When institutions start moving people through tunnels instead of hallways, it's not theater, it's risk mitigation. And this is where the story pauses, not because it's resolved, but because everything that follows depends on a single unresolved question. When a president refuses to acknowledge legal reality, when political allies withdraw, when governors resist, when courts escalate, and when the language of force enters domestic governance, there are only a few paths left. Some are constitutional, some are not spoken about publicly, and some, once triggered, cannot be controlled by anyone. The machinery is already in motion. What remains unclear is which lever will be pulled first. From that point forward, everything stopped being symbolic. The language hardened. The timelines shortened. What had been framed as political conflict turned into an institutional stress test with measurable thresholds. Congress did not act emotionally, it acted procedurally, and that distinction matters more than any speech. A resolution demanding resignation does not remove a president by itself, but it does something far more dangerous for the person in office. It strips ambiguity. It tells every other branch, every agency, every governor, and every court that hesitation is no longer required. The system has taken a position. After that, neutrality becomes liability. This is the part they usually keep quiet about. Once Congress records a bipartisan demand, it creates cover. Cover for cabinet members to move without fear of isolation. A cover for judges to escalate enforcement without being accused of overreach. Cover for governors to resist federal pressure without appearing insubordinate. And cover for security institutions to prepare for outcomes that are normally unthinkable. The vote count mattered not because of legality, but because of scale. It exceeded what would be needed for impeachment. It signaled that removal was no longer a fringe idea, but an accepted endpoint. The concept introduced into the official language was even more telling. Abdication, not resignation, not impeachment. Abdication is colder than both. It implies absence, not rebellion. A president who refuses court orders, barricades himself politically, and communicates primarily through defiant broadcasts is framed not as a fighter, but as someone who has stepped outside the function of the office. That framing is deliberate. It allows institutions to act while claiming they are not overthrowing power, only reclaiming it. Meanwhile, the president's response did exactly what his remaining defenders feared. It removed any remaining doubt about instability. Calls framed as resistance, threats framed as inevitability, and language that security agencies are trained to interpret as incitement. At that moment, the calculus changed. This was no longer about political survival. It became about public safety. Agencies do not debate rhetoric. They assess probability. And probability rose sharply. The domestic security posture shifted accordingly. Nationwide alerts, expanded guard deployments, elevated readiness across federal facilities. Not because anyone wanted confrontation, but because once a head of state invokes internal conflict, even indirectly, planners must assume some portion of the audience will act. History has already demonstrated that dynamic. No one responsible pretends otherwise. At the state level, the Illinois confrontation crystallized a much deeper constitutional fault line than most people initially realized. This was not a dispute over rhetoric or political loyalty. It was a direct test of where federal authority actually ends when legitimacy itself is contested. The president's attempt to compel the use of state-controlled forces against state residents exposed a vulnerability that is rarely discussed outside constitutional law circles. Governors are not field commanders awaiting orders. They are independent constitutional actors with their own obligations, their own chains of accountability, and their own duty to interpret legality when federal directives collide with state sovereignty. A refusal in this context would not be theatrical defiance or political posturing. It would immediately trigger judicial review, emergency injunctions, and parallel rulings across multiple courts. More importantly, it would establish a precedent that reaches far beyond Illinois. Once a governor successfully resists federalization on grounds of illegitimacy or unlawful purpose, the entire balance of domestic power shifts. That is why the threat mattered. Not because of troop numbers or logistics, but because forcing the issue would redraw the boundary between federal command and state resistance in a way no administration could easily reverse. Behind all of this, the legal pressure continued tightening with a mechanical inevitability that political messaging could no longer slow down. Testimony under oath closed loopholes that had long protected ambiguity and delay. Statements that once lived in press speculation were now fixed in sworn record, where contradictions carry consequences. Court orders that had previously been treated as background noise began to assert real force. Property seizures, financial judgments, enforcement actions followed their own timeline. These are not political tools, and that is precisely why they are so dangerous to anyone trying to govern through defiance. They do not respond to outrage, loyalty, or threats. They execute. When the same physical location becomes both a political stronghold and the subject of active legal seizure, the illusion of control collapses. Symbolism turns into vulnerability and power loses its insulation. Inside the executive branch, conversations that had lingered for months as contingency planning crossed a quiet threshold. The 25th Amendment is often discussed publicly as a constitutional curiosity, something dramatic but unlikely. In reality, it is administrative. It functions like a switch, not a trial. Once enough actors conclude that incapacity exists, the transition does not require persuasion or approval. It requires signatures. That is all. The congressional resolution changed the internal environment decisively. It reframed removal not as rebellion or betrayal, but as stabilization. It told cabinet members that action would not isolate them politically or historically. It lowered the psychological barrier that often prevents institutions from using the tools they already possess. Internationally, the signal was just as clear and far more consequential than public statements suggested. Allies do not need explanations. They read behavior, alignment, and sequence. When legislative and judicial branches move in coordination against an executive, the message is that continuity is being managed internally. That reassurance matters. At the same time, adversaries read the same signal as opportunity: weakness, distraction, transition. That dual perception is unavoidable in moments like this, and it is precisely why speed becomes critical. Prolonged uncertainty invites external testing, not necessarily through overt action but through pressure, probes, and opportunism. What remains unresolved is not whether the system can remove a president. That question has already been answered, repeatedly, through action rather than declaration. The unresolved question is cost. Cost in institutional legitimacy, cost in violence avoided or incurred, cost in precedent that will shape future crises. Every hour of defiance increases that cost. Every escalation narrows the remaining options and hardens responses that might otherwise remain flexible. There is still a narrow path where transition occurs without confrontation, where authority transfers quietly and damage remains contained within procedural boundaries. But that path requires acceptance of reality, and nothing in the president's recent behavior suggests acceptance is forthcoming. Institutions understand this. They always plan for the least cooperative outcome, not the most graceful one. This is not the collapse of a system, it is the exposure of its stress points under extreme pressure. The machinery is still functioning, but it is operating at maximum load. Whether it emerges reinforced or permanently scarred depends on decisions being made now, out of sight by people who understand one unforgiving rule of power mechanics. Once the next mechanism activates, there is no rewind.